got a lot of great guesses from you good folks, but what was wrong with my 261 that day? I'll tell you today on GP Outdoors. Welcome back. I was just going to post the answer on the channel as I promised you, but I got so many good responses, I just thought I'd address a few of them, as well as a bunch of questions that came up. So if you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link to it here, but it was the last video I posted. I was out in the forest and I had a problem with the saw cutting hardwood. So for you new folks to the channel, I am by no means an expert on chainsaws, but I will share some of my experience and knowledge, or at least things that I believe to be true, and I hope that helps you good folks out as well. One of the main answers that I received in the comments on that video was that there was a suggestion that the chain was far too tight. And that wasn't the case. My still dealer told me, and I try to maintain and have for years, that when I'm done for the day, I'll loosen the chain off. I don't usually ever put the saw away for the day with the chain still tensioned. And that's because, according to him, you're leaving tension on the sprocket all the time. So you'll see, although I edited this out for the final version of the video, this is what happened just before I began cutting. It's what I normally do. I tighten my chain and then I check it to make sure that it's at the right tension before I begin cutting. And the way I know it's at the right tension is because I pull up in the middle of the bar, as we're taught to do. I make sure that I've got a good snap to it, but that I'm very easily or reasonably able to lift it up so that the bottom of the links are just able to exceed the top of the bar. And more importantly, I grab it and I run the chain back and forth on the bar. And if I have to put any effort into pushing that chain along, I know it's too tight. It should flow pretty freely, but not loosely so much that you can pull it right out of the channel on the bar. So my chain was good. So one of the next biggest answers is that a number of you folks thought that I was not getting enough bar oil. And in fact, many of you suggested that the end or the tip of my bar was burned. It actually wasn't. This is actually a US made bar. It's a 20-inch. It's a Farm Boss, so it's got some fancy graphics on it. You'll see there are no burn marks. That's just the dark, deep black color of the graphic that they put on the bar. And in fact, if you look across the bar, you'll see it's not burned anywhere. In fact, none of my bars have ever burned because I always check the flow of my bar oil. That's my big 28-inch for the 462. And this one, I believe, is a 20-inch for my 261. What you do see is you'll see some tanning, so to speak. It's kind of like resin because you're putting that bar in, and as it gets hot, you're cutting through wood. But this literally comes off with my thumbnail. I've never burned a bar, and I've never had burn marks on a bar yet. It's because I check my bar oil flow. The way I know I'm getting enough bar oil is because the oiler is set at its medium or standard position for these types of bars. My still dealer set it up for me. But I understand that both the fuel tank and the oil bar, or the bar oil reservoir, are engineered so that when you run out of fuel, you should have just a little bit of oil left in the bottom of this reservoir. That kind of is a big indicator that you're getting enough flow to your bar for general purpose cutting, with one exception, which I'll get to. So religiously, every time I run out of gas, I go to fill, I check. And as long as my bar oil is close to the bottom, I know I'm getting a good flow. That, combined with the fact that I have no burn marks on the side of my bar, tells me that I should be getting more than enough oil flow out of this. However, I understand that depending on what you're cutting, you may have to adjust that oiler. And the adjustment, as you folks know, is down at the bottom of the bar on most of these stills. And you simply turn it clockwise to increase the bar oil flow, or you turn it counterclockwise to decrease it. I've never had to adjust it. I have a feeling, though, that in your manual where it says that you need to adjust it based on what you're cutting, although it doesn't go into detail, I would imagine that when you're dealing with hardwoods or dry hardwoods, where you find, as I do, that the bar or the cut tends to be a little longer or a little harder to make, that may be one of those instances where they suggest you turn up or you provide more oil to the bar. Is that what affected the issue? I don't think so, and I'll tell you why in a second. But I think the challenge that I have, and probably many of you have, is that you're not in an area where you have the same type of wood that you're bucking every day. You've got a pile of logs, trees that you felled, different species, and some are green and some are close to season or very, very dry. So in the same log pile, you're not going to keep trying to adjust your oil. You try to keep it at a point where you're not burning the bar and you're able to cut, and you're certainly not seeing smoke, which I have seen in the past. So is that what contributed to the issue with the saw? I don't think so. What was the issue with the saw that day? My nose sprocket got jammed up with chips, so much so that it stopped the saw and the power of the saw couldn't turn it any longer. It's not the first time it's happened. And in fact, several of you good folks guessed that in the comments. Good on you. Over the years, this usually happens to me maybe once, maybe twice a season, no more than that. It's a very rare occurrence, but it happens. If you own a STIHL, you'll notice that the sprocket is an enclosed sprocket. It's not greasable. The Husqvarna bars usually have a grease hole right here, and you're able to grease that sprocket. I don't think that's going to solve the problem. It's not the problem with the bar, because both Neighbor Guy and Husky Bob, as you know, run Huskies. They both run bars that have a greasable nose sprocket, and they both suffer the same issue I do, once, twice a year, not often. What I have learned over the years is it appears over time that it only happens when I'm trying to buck really dry hardwood like maple. And in fact, one of you folks said you have the same issue with dry maple. And that bigger log in the pile that day was in fact dry maple. It was really dry. And I've learned that I can tell very easily whether that log is green or really dry because it does cut differently. So that was the issue that day. And to get it cleared out, I had to pull the saw apart, get the chain off it, and then I just used my raker gauge. At the very end, there's a very thin tip, which is what I use usually to clean out the channel in the bar. And I just started digging away at it until I got enough chips out and was able to get it to spin again. And that's kind of always been the solution. If I'm back at the workshop, I'm able to use the air compressor. Works a lot better because you're able to push 100 PSI into there to get those chips out. But that was the issue that day. Since we're talking about chainsaws, I wanted to answer a couple other questions while we're here. A question I get a lot over the years are people are asking me what length of bar I run on my 261. And I've generally, traditionally, since the day I got it, I've run an 18-inch bar. A lot of folks say that they're running a 20-inch bar. And in fact, I was very fortunate that one of you kind folks sent me a 20-inch bar last Christmas. And as you probably noticed, this is the bar I've been running just until recently. Here's why I run an 18-inch. When I first bought the saw, my dealer told me not to run a 20-inch on that 261. He said that a 16, of course, is great. An 18 is about as far as you want to go, even though STIHL has a recommendation that you can use a 16, 18, or 20-inch on that 261. The challenge, he said, is that you're going to notice a very material drop in power. And of course, I had no experience until the last 7 months. But I do now. I'm not sure if power or torque or there's some other physics term to describe it, but it makes a lot of sense. The longer the chain, the further out you're cutting from the power head itself, you're going to lose some power. And that makes sense to me. I didn't realize it was that noticeable. And I can assure you, now that I've got some experience, although I'm not that experienced overall, you will absolutely notice a significant drop in cutting power when you go from an 18-inch bar to a 20-inch bar. From the first time I put this bar on the saw, I noticed immediately the difference in power, and I've had 7 months to work with it. At the end of the day, as you can see, I put my 18-inch back on it. I'm going to keep this, of course, because it's an excellent bar and it's in excellent condition. And it is kind of nice sometimes to have that extra couple inches. But at the end of the day, for what we cut here, and because the saw performs so much differently with the 18-inch, I've put the 18-inch back on it. But I hope that answers the questions that I get on a regular basis over the last few years. I now have experience with both blades. This is a light bar. This is your standard bar. But this is far more powerful with the 18-inch. And my STIHL dealer was 100% right. Put the 20-inch on it and you will notice the drop in power immediately. It just does not cut as powerful with that extra couple inches. Why do I clean the saw so often? In fact, almost every day. It takes 10 minutes. But what that allows me to do is to get any of the residue out of the channel of the bar. It allows me to clean out in and around the sprocket, make sure it still spins freely. And most importantly, I want to make sure that where the oil comes out, or the oiler, that reservoir or that channel is cleared out, as well as the holes on the bar to make sure that I'm getting the proper flow I should get. Then I fill it up with fuel and of course with bar oil. I sharpen my chain and it makes for a much more enjoyable day out in the forest. It's worth spending the 10 or 15 minutes every morning. And I think probably a lot of you folks that have had some experience with it, and probably far more than me, know that if you keep that saw dirty for a few days, more and more debris, chips, what I'd almost refer to as kind of gunk because it's mixed with oil, slowly packs up inside the casing around your sprocket, and you start to find that you're plugging that channel for oil. And I think that's when you're going to start finding your bar is overheating or you're not getting enough oil to the bar. Because whether you see it visibly or not, when you run out of gas and you open up your oil reservoir and that reservoir is only halfway empty or 3/4 of the way full, you know you've got a problem. So if you start the day off right with a coffee, clean that saw out, sharpen your chain, clean out the channel in the bar, make sure the oil passage or channel is free, you have a much better day out in the forest. You run your saw for a couple hours or for an hour, you shut it off, you go to start it again 5 or 10 minutes later and it won't start. Is it a 261 problem? I don't think only a 261 issue. You guys know I'm not mechanical, but I was having the same issue from time to time. I talked to my STIHL dealer and what he told me was, I believe it's called vapor lock. So if you run the saw hard, you're bucking up a bunch of logs and you stop bucking and you immediately shut the saw off when the engine is really hot, something happens, and I believe he referred to it as vapor lock. He explained it to me, I just can't explain it to you guys. But he told me to do the same thing that's written in my manual. He said that after you finish bucking, you want to leave the saw at idle for about 30 seconds to a minute before you shut it off. And I believe that gives the engine a chance to cool down and minimizes any chance of vapor lock in there before you shut it off. I've been doing that since I started to have this issue last year, and so far it's worked great. I haven't had the problem since. I always try to make sure I let it idle for about 30 to 45 seconds before I shut it off. That way when I pull it again, it usually starts right up, and I have yet to have that issue since. So I hope that's helpful. Last thing I wanted to touch on, because I didn't want this to be a long video for you folks, is I get questions about this Firewood Pro Sizer marking tool, as well as the Mingo marker. And some of the comments I get is, you're wasting time marking your wood before you cut it. And maybe just to address that, I think some of you folks that have been doing this for decades probably have a good eye for 16 inches. And I know a lot of you said you don't use a marker anymore because you can just tell. And I would imagine repetitively over decades, I'll one day get there. But for now, I need something to mark them. The other very important benefit to it is that, as you guys know, most of our wood is bucked and split and put into Guy's shed. About 3 to 5 cords a year goes to Husky, and Husky's got his stacks normal, regular 4 feet high. Chuck's got a stack, Bill when he was here, Ralph, etc. We all work together quite often. The difference though is that in Guy's shed, he stacks 8 feet high. And when you stack that high, it's so important to have consistently bucked firewood. If you don't, that stack becomes more unstable the higher you go. So if you're bucking at 16 and 15 and 18 because you're guessing, that ends up causing a problem when you try to stack at 8 feet. Even if you could argue or debate that in the first stack itself, it's not a big deal. But as you're stacking 7 rows in front of each other, that difference makes a big difference, and it causes a very unsafe situation. And not to go into detail, but there's a reason why Guy and Bob are so specific about wanting exactly 16-inch wood. And that's because there was a very bad accident here several years ago. Somebody ended up in the hospital, and at the end of the day, it was determined to be attributed to the fact that we did not have consistent lengths, and those stacks became unstable. So it's pretty important that, at least in our case, we keep them at 16. If I was selling wood, of course, it's another reason why you want to be consistently at the same length so that people get consistent product. Last question, why do I use the Pro Sizer sometimes and sometimes I use a Mingo marker to mark the wood? And the answer to that is kind of simple. Green or red laser, for me, personally, I see both of them very well. I do see the green much better than the red, especially in the bright sunlight. And I understand that if you have any type of color blindness, you're not going to see the red laser. But the green you should be able to see. It comes up very brightly. As far as the green versus the red, you're going to get a full day of bucking out of the red one. You're going to get about half a day out of the battery on the green one. I hope that's helpful to you. If we felled 1 or 2 trees, or I've got 1 or 2 logs, it's a lot easier for me just to hit a button and start bucking my lynx. If we're in a position where perhaps Husky Bob's out and Guy and myself, or maybe Ralph, and we have a ton of logs to do, that's often where you'll see we'll use the Mingo marker, because while we're setting up or somebody's doing one part of the log pile, or if we've got them spread out in the forest, you've got one guy just running along with a marker and he just marks them, and it's very quick. And that allows, or more or less paves the way for the rest of us as we get to each log. It's already got a dot on it. We don't have to worry about trying to mark it or not. The other reason why is because myself and I think Husky Bob are the only ones currently using a Pro Sizer. So if we've got 2 or 3 of us out there or more, we just want all of the logs to be marked all at once, so that no matter where either one of us goes, we've got a marked log to start bucking right away. And that kind of more or less is how I determine whether I'm using the Pro Sizer on the side of my saw or if we've got somebody out there with a Mingo marker. Anyways, I didn't want to make this a long video, but I did want to answer you guys. Thanks, had a little fun reading all the comments on the last video. I appreciate you guys that participated. Hopefully it gave you a little something to do on a Saturday. Have a great week with your families. Please be kind to one another, and I'll see you again right here. I'm Gord Potter, and you've been watching GP Outdoors. Cheers.